Hello, and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Hello, and welcome to episode number 42 of the Red Zone podcast, where I invite IT security innovators, leading entrepreneurial minds, and inspiring individuals to share their stories and offer best tips to help you achieve success in IT security, IT business thought leadership, neuroscience of optimal performance, creativity, and innovation. And I'm your host, Bill Murphy. And in today's show, I'm excited to bring to you my interview with Jack Jones. This is Jack's second time in the show, and I loved our discussion. It's a gem of learning and is packed with information you can use right away. Jack was one of the first CISOs in the United States, which is kind of cool. And he's the inventor of the FAIR model for analyzing information security risks. That's capital FAIR. Jack's bio is extensive. Here's just a short list of his accomplishments. He's been working in technology for over 30 years and in the information security and risk management for 25. He's over 9 years of experience as a CISO with 3 different companies, including 5 years at a Fortune 100 financial services company. And he received the ISSA Excellence in the Field of Security Practice Award at the 2006 RSA conference. And in 2007, he was selected as a finalist for the Information Security Executive of the Year in Central United States. And in 2012 was honored with the CISO Compass Award for leadership and risk management. He's also author and creator, as I mentioned, of FAIR, which is really cool. This framework, the FAIR framework, which stands for Factor Analysis of Information Risk. And he currently serves on the ISC2 Ethics Committee and is currently the Executive Vice President of Research and Development at RiskLens. So suffice it to say that Jack is a rock star in the information security and IT risk community, and I thought his bio really warranted special attention there. But let's talk about some of the takeaways for the show. There's really just a 5. So why top 10 lists for IT security are useless? Everybody walks in with their top 10 lists, and he explains why this is total garbage and gives you a way to dig out of that. Also, how to add probability and possibility of events happening into your risk models. Also, how to present data that your board of directors will love. Also, how to develop ranges into your communications about risk areas. And how to apply critical thinking, logic, and Socratic methods to your analysis. Finally, how to apply rigor in developing defensible arguments. I love that word, defensible arguments. So just a quick mention to our sponsor. This episode is sponsored by the CIO Security Scoreboard. If you're interested in transforming and maturing your ability to distill complexity and present powerfully in IT security, governance, and risk areas to your vertical reports, both upstream, downstream, or horizontal peers, check out visualcio.com. Again, that's visualcio.com. So with this, I want to welcome you to my interview with Jack Jones. Well, Jack, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Thank you very much. Great to be here.
Well, this was a favorite episode of mine from last year when you and I talked, because we had met at a seminar, and I had listened to you talk about FAIR, the factor analysis of information risk. And I thought one way we could do this is I do have some specific examples with stories that I'd love for you to answer. Like, what is a good definition of FAIR?
Great question. So FAIR is first and foremost a framework for critical thinking. It is a model or a codification, if you will, of risk and how risk works. And as you know, in being that, it provides this reference then for thinking through complex risk-related questions or problems, surfacing assumptions, enabling non-religious debate-like dialogue that is so common in risk discussions. So that's, I think, sums it up.
Yeah, one of the things that I struggle with is that I feel that when do you think the first information security leaders were really landing in organizations at the really CISO level in major companies in US? When do you think that was happening or starting, the genesis of it?
Early 2000s, late 1990s, early 2000s. I mean, that's when Nationwide brought on a CISO in 2000, Nationwide Insurance. And then that person left early 2001, and I was brought in then as their second one. And Nationwide was fairly, leading edge in that regard, in having a CISO. So I would say late 1990s, early 2000s.
Okay, so yeah, and you were one of the first CISOs landing in, and I know from the CIO perspective, maybe the late 80s, 86, I think the first CIOs were getting. It's interesting looking at American business just from a philosophically looking at them from like the leadership areas like chief operating officer, CEOs, and HR leaders and sales leaders, and to see kind of when they all started within companies and when that position was formed. And I think there was probably a very big head start on IT. So I find that it would be interesting to talk about the concept of helping and in CISOs that are in organizations now to help them understand how to present risk and how you've developed this technique and methodology with FAIR and to do that. And what about, maybe we can start with the concept of possibility versus probability.
Mm-hmm.
And I have an interesting story about this because recently we had a customer that they called us, and they it's a fairly good sized organization, maybe mid-market, and a virus had taken them down. And what I mean by that is that this was a virus that not only McAfee had no signature for, Alert Logic, which is supposed to be really advanced kind of zero-day protection that Trend hadn't caught, none of the filters in their firewalls that had AV protection, nothing caught it. And it was it was impacting this 600-person company and disrupting operations for 3 consecutive days. And when we finally traced it out, we found that it was really the genesis was it was an exploit in 2003 in XP Systems. That was a contractor, had a major contractor, like a multi tens of $billion company, required them to have certain systems on their network. And this fairly sophisticated, for a mid-market company with security tools and technologies, was essentially, it had a serious limp for a couple of days. And we were completely blindsided. Forget 0 day. This was like 3, 4, 5 days that
right.
Just no. And to this day, probably the root cause has not been rooted out. So we've got all the symptoms taken care of, but not the root. So my question is, how do you gauge that they knew ahead of time that they had issues with 2003, issues with XP? They knew they had administrator issues with an admin was using could use a personal machine for web surfing and email, and then was using the same account privileges to go into the admin systems. They knew they had all these problems. Yet, and look at the net result. So how would someone apply a FAIR if you could roll the clock back? I can hear you laughing.
Right. Yeah. No, and it's a great scenario. So, organization that knows they have these control deficiencies, right? The, excess and administrative privileges and these sorts of things, in doing a risk analysis of their landscape, they're saying, all right, what are the things we have to worry about given what we do for business and the threat landscape we face and our control conditions and such? What are these scenarios that could be painful for us? And so an organization can develop a fairly straightforward taxonomy to say, all right, and you can leverage the old CIA confidentiality, availability, or integrity, availability, high-level taxonomy as a starting point. So from a confidentiality perspective, what information assets would really hurt if they were disclosed in some fashion. From an integrity perspective, what information or systems, if if integrity were violated in some fashion, would be very painful to us, and same thing for availability. And then they can go to a deeper level of granularity and say, all right, which business processes or which threat communities, what kinds of events. So essentially, through a step-by-step process, develop a taxonomy of, all right, these events, these actors, these kinds of conditions and such represent loss events that could be very painful. Now let's analyze for each of those, given our control conditions, what's the likelihood and impact for those. And so that gives them a way to identify the top issues, given the state of their landscape, to pay attention to. All right. If an organization had done that, and certainly information security professionals would have included in that set of scenarios the notion of some zero-day thing that their protective controls like anti-malware and such wouldn't have been able to handle, right? And they might have rated the probability as low, but again, given their infrastructure and that sort of thing, the impact could have been significant. So when you have something like that, where you have significant impact, and even if the likelihood is low because of some controls you have in place or that sort of thing, you want to be able to then, your options then for dealing with it are fast detection and recovery. And so if they were down for 3 days, that suggests that maybe their recovery capabilities weren't maybe what they could or should have been. So at any rate, that's how an organization can go about in a rigorous fashion, sort of laying out their risk landscape and finding those scenarios that maybe on the surface they kind of understand exist, but don't really understand where that sits relative to the other things in their landscape that they're managing. So it's a way to sort of triage their world and perhaps identify a set of conditions like that organization had where there was work to be done and could have prioritized it more effectively. Is that helpful?
Yes, and I think one of the pieces that I really enjoyed reading from your book was the concept of probability versus possibility. Mm-hmm. And then you also, I think, might have even linked it to like a game of Russian roulette. And I'd love to, maybe we could take that apart, because I thought that was really interesting, because if you did reel back the clock, we roll back the clock to this scenario that if this organization had the opportunity to lay this out for business decision makers, mm-hmm. is maybe you can explain the difference between possibility and probability as it relates to that metaphor mm-hmm. that I just described.
Yeah, so and a lot of organizations that I encounter fall into this trap of focusing on the possible and not including, probability considerations, right? And from a prioritization perspective, if for example, those events that are conceivably possible within the realm of not science fiction, possible and hugely painful, well, asteroid strike would come up, Sure. And what do we do for asteroid strikes and that sort of thing, right? So, and you really can't prioritize solely on possibility. There has to be this probability element in it. The whole Russian roulette thing, just to quickly reprise that for the audience, if I were in the position of having to play Russian roulette and I had the good fortune, I guess, of being able to choose between two handguns, a 6-cylinder revolver with a single bullet in one of the chambers, or a semi-automatic with a single bullet chambered, the possibility in both cases is 100%. It's 100% possible. Right. I'm going to have a bad day, right? The probability is importantly different, right? And so from a decision-making perspective, having that information about probability is crucial. And so it's the same thing in our IT risk world. I mean, there are a lot of things that are possible. We have to, in order to prioritize, we have to understand the probabilities and factor that in as well.
So in the situation I just described, they knew clearly that they had a risk of old systems, And
Yep.
those old systems, although it didn't just hit old systems, it hit all systems, except it nuked the System 32 directory of the old systems. So there was, and they knew that because of the admin issue that it would grab a hold of admin credentials and have unfettered access to wipe things out. So how would you reverse engineer that situation for the audience?
In that instance, they understand there's a high probability of encountering malware, right? I mean, that happens constantly. So the only question then from a probability perspective is, what are the odds? What's the probability of encountering malware that their preventative measures, their antivirus stuff, isn't going to be capable of handling? And again, I think most information security professionals would probably say, 0 days happen with some regularity, so that is not an asteroid strike kind of event.
Right.
So the probability is higher. You add to that in terms of doing the analysis. So if I were in that organization and we were maybe had laid out this some taxonomy like I mentioned, and this was one of the scenarios, and we were evaluating the probability and impact associated with it, I would say, well, okay, from a threat perspective, the 0 day stuff happens with some regularity, and even though we spend money on good anti-malware, it's imperfect, right? So we'd be able to come up with a reasoned estimate as to the likelihood, and there's a process for coming up with those estimates that maybe we can talk about if you're interested.
Love to, I'd love to cover that. We can go back to that one for sure.
Okay, so you come up with that estimate of likelihood, and one of the factors then that actually plays more into the impact than the likelihood of the event is that administrative privilege exposure, right? Because what that does is it allows the malware to have greater control and have a broader, more significant impact than otherwise it would. So it might play, again, depending on the malware, it might play a role in the likelihood, but it would certainly play a role in the impact side of the equation. But that's how I would go about it. And there's this other kind of component, and that is given their circumstance, the admin privileges and maybe, I don't know what their patching situation was and configuration management situation was too. Those would be factors in the evaluation as well. But they might have been in what we refer to as a fragile state. And that is, they're wholly dependent on that anti-malware solution, right? Because the administrative privileges being what they were, and maybe patching and other things not being in a particularly good state, they're just trusting to this single control element. And if it fails in some fashion, then all bets are off. So within FAIR, there's not only this notion of evaluating probability and impact, but we also have two states that can be important considerations. One is fragile, where you're dependent on a single control in an active threat landscape. And the other is unstable, where you have some asset or something you want to protect that exists in a not very active landscape, but you really have no resistive or preventive controls. You're just trusting to luck, right? And a good example of that for many organizations is databases, where you're evaluating scenarios involving rogue database administrators. Well, they have the access they're supposed to have to do good things for the organization, but if they go rogue, you don't have anything in place to stop them.
Sure.
Right? That's an unstable condition.
Okay.
Right? And so that means when you identify unstable conditions, you have to look for early detection and, how do we detect and resolve an incident as quickly as possible, minimize damage, because you really have, in many cases, no resistive options, right? But at any rate, that's kind of a little bit of a tangent, but it gives you a sense for when you're evaluating these things, You have probability and impact, and then these two qualifiers, the fragile and unstable, can be just a really important little extra piece of information to help us say, how much do we care about this?
Yeah, that is I like how you broke that out between probability and impact, and then those two outliers, whether you have a fragile or unstable weakness. I think one of the pieces that would be really useful, I know I would find really interesting, and listeners as well, is how so in a set of, let's say, just make it really simple. Let's say there were 10 findings. We've rolled back the clock and the timeline here, and there's 10 findings, and one of them is this one we've just been noodling through a bit. But how would you estimate the likelihood of it happening? So we've talked about the probability of a 0 day is pretty high. Well, how do we lay in some math around that so we don't scare people away?
Right. So in our industry, there's a very strong tendency to do ordinal sorts of qualitative things, high, medium, low, 1 through 5 sorts of scales and such. All kinds of downsides to that. One being that they don't allow you to really very effectively articulate best case, worst case, most likely case, sort of the range of outcomes. So from a probability perspective, and let's say we're talking about this scenario, it wouldn't take a lot of work to look at industry data on the frequency of 0 day exploits that are relevant to the technologies in this particular organization, right? And maybe those come up, over the last 3 years, maybe one year there were 5, another year there were 15, right? So you've got kind of two ends of a spectrum there. And depending, again, on how you see the threat landscape evolving, do you see more of those, the trend towards more, or is it trending fewer? But at any rate, you can, using the data you have, you can say, well, let's set the minimum as 5. Maybe we'd have a very good year over the next year or two. And we'll say the minimum frequency of 0 day exploits that are relevant to this, technology that we're concerned about in our landscape is 5. The maximum is 15. Or let's say we want to be add a little paranoia in there and say 20. Right.
And you look at this expressed over, excuse me for the interruption, but is it expressed over a year? You're looking for a year?
Yeah, we typically annualize this. Over the coming year, we'd expect to see,
Got it. Okay.
This kind of frequency. And depending on the quality of your data and how much uncertainty you have, you can make that range wider or narrower, right? So one thing I think is really important to add here is faithfully representing your uncertainty in your estimates is critical. I mean, a lot of people, when they think of putting numbers to things, they put a single discrete number. You ask somebody, what do you think the frequency of this event is? First thing their mind goes to is, you want a number? Well, no, I never want a number. I want a range that reflects how much we think we know about this, right? Both in terms of, and there are two dimensions for that, right? We have the width of the range to express our uncertainty, but we also, if we choose a most likely value, kind of the peak of the distribution within that range, how flat or how sharply peaked do we want that distribution to be? Sure. And if your readers are familiar with PERT distributions, which have been around a long, long time, started, I think, in the Navy for estimating project management timelines and budgets and those sorts of things, that's a very effective way of leveraging these 3 data points, a minimum, a maximum, and a most likely, in a very simple, straightforward fashion that allows you to express your uncertainty in your data and what you understand.
That's a really good point, expressing the range of uncertainty. I like the way you've presented that. And, one of the things that's interesting, just this comes back to I'm building upon the maturity level of the industry, is that when the VP of sales walks in and says, I will deliver to you $4 billion in revenue this year to the CEO, there is zero likelihood that he's right on the mark. Zero.
Exactly. Exactly.
It's low, here's what I express, here's what I want to gather for you for revenue and through these channels. But I mean, you got to be kidding me. There's always a range, and there's changing budgets as revenue slides up and down. And so it's really interesting in the profession. What you've just said here is essentially you're communicating like from very similar to other peer would we be doing.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that is remarkable to me how many people in the information security profession, at least, and I was guilty of this to begin with too, think that when you try to quantify something, precision is key. Precision takes a distant second to accuracy. So if I give you a range that correctly incorporates or includes the actual outcomes, then my range was accurate, right? And you increase the probability of accuracy with wider ranges, right? But there's diminishing returns in terms of utility from a decision-making perspective. So let me give you an example. If someone were to ask me what my personal income was going to be this year, and I said $500,032.14, to your point a minute ago, the odds of that being exactly right are somewhere near zero, right? If I were to say, well, I'm going to earn between 1 cent and $500 million, well, that's almost, unless something really bad or really good happens, that's going to be accurate, but it's not going to be very useful, right? There's a point in between where you're able to actually provide useful intelligence to the person you're giving this information to, and still, so it's a useful degree of precision with a confidence level you can stand behind. And there's a process for arriving at that called calibration, making calibrated estimates. And there are some really good resources on the web, and Douglas Hubbard has a book, How to Measure Anything, that covers it beautifully.
Douglas Hubbard?
Douglas Hubbard, right. And when we put people through FAIR training, this is part of it. There's a 2 or 3 hour section in the 2.5-day training that is all about calibration. And we give people a pre-quiz, so to speak, to sort of give a baseline for where they start out as in terms of their ability to estimate accurately. And it's a 10-question pre-quiz, if you will, or baseline. And the average number of correct answers is 2 to 3 out of 10, so 20 to 30%. Human beings are not good estimators naturally. Most people really stink at it. And so we give them the pre-quiz and they get 20 to 30% right typically. 2 hours later, they get 80 to 90% right. Some people get 100% and those sorts of things. So it's not rocket science. It's not hard. It's very straightforward. And it can be so incredibly useful in terms of the kinds of estimates and decision making that we have around risk management or project management or buying a car or, dealing with your kids' educational funding needs or whatever the case might be. It can be incredibly useful.
So to the point you just made about utility for decision making versus in this estimating concept, I don't want to let up on that just for a moment because I just want to make sure I understand. So what you're saying is in expressing ranges, there's a point in which it is not useful for decision making. So when you're presenting risk to a decision maker, in that decision maker, you're trying to influence the decision to make buying decisions. To let's go back to our example of 10. There are 10 risk areas of which you think that 2 or 3 of these are the highest risk, highest probability. You've made your case. Where do you see it falling apart in regards to this calibration and the estimation piece for helping with the decision maker make that decision?
Yeah, that's a marvelous question. Here's an example. In fact, I'm in the process of writing a blog series that touches on this a little bit. So let's look at the ordinal scales that organizations tend to rely on, high, medium, and low, right? Those are buckets. And so organizations will identify, quote unquote, their top 10 risks. And this blog series I'm doing is all about how screwed up that whole process is and how to do it better. But so they identify these 10 things in their landscape that worry them, that keep them up at night, that they would all place into this quote unquote high risk bucket, right? You've got 3 buckets there to put things in, and one of them is called high. But out of the 10 things you put in that bucket, what are the top 3? How do you differentiate within that bucket? There is only one layer of abstraction worse than a 3-level buckets, or 3 buckets in terms of precision or lack thereof, right? The only way to get less precise than high, medium, and low is to have it just be 2 buckets, right? I mean, you cannot get less precise than that. So organizations do that. And then, of course, if you ask them, well, all right, you put these 10 things in there, what about number 11 and 12? Why aren't they in there? And what makes them different? And people can't answer that because they've just used these ordinal scales and they haven't thought through it with enough rigor in any case I've ever encountered to defend in a very rigorous fashion, why number 11 didn't make it in the top 10 versus, say, number 5 in that bucket or whatever the case might be. So you've been able, using this very imprecise set of buckets, you kind of threw things into the buckets, and that's, people are, organizations are making decisions based on that, but they aren't being very effective because it's so limited in being able to differentiate stuff that matters. If you're using a quantitative measure where you're using distributions and ranges and such, you can say, all right, let's say, for example, you've got 2 issues that the most likely value within the ranges, the peak of the distributions is the same, but one has a higher worst case. That end of the distribution is higher. That's information that allows you to prioritize that above the other. Or if you have one where the most likely value, the distribution shape is flatter, you have less certainty about that than the other one. All other things being equal, I would probably focus on the thing that I have less certainty about. I want to gain more certainty about that, or that lack of certainty is a risk factor that needs to be dealt with. So I'm not sure I've hit exactly on the answer to your question just yet, but I'm getting there.
Yeah, no, this is good. This is really good. So I have another practical example that lays into this. I think may give you further ammunition to build this case. So we have the first example that I mentioned, which real practical, literally happened within the past 14 days. But then there's also another one that happened within the past 14 days, which just makes my blood boil. It's a person who runs a financial institution, and she's in charge of the security teams and the infrastructure teams, et cetera. And she has a real, not a big financial institution, but just kind of a medium one. And they have auditors trying to jam technologies down their throat. And one of them is they have to have data at rest encryption. This is a must-have, data at rest. And what's funny is that in looking through your book, I saw there was a whole section of applying FAIR to that scenario. But what was interesting to me is that that is one very telescopic piece that an auditor is throwing around her. And she hasn't developed the sophistication in her communication and her understanding of these methodologies to be able to defensibly explain to the business decision maker why she would like to spend money in other places that have higher risk. And instead, she's going to go spend a godly amount of money in just encrypting hard drives instead of a whole host of other things she could be doing. So how could someone, again, back out of what you're saying is an auditor's come in and said, this is high. And the board is sitting there going, we need to listen to auditors because we're in a load of hot water if we don't have a good audit findings versus real security, which it's like they're at odds, real security and audit findings. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah. So again, it isn't, I'll state up front, it isn't just auditors that tend to gravitate around quote unquote best practices regardless of whether they make any sense. But, I see regulators do it. I see information security colleagues do it. I see technologists, so on. But in that instance, even before you get to the notion of quantifying anything, a really key component to dealing with that is to apply real rigor to developing or defining the scenarios where encryption of data at rest is relevant. right? So you encrypt your hard drives. Wonderful. That's very helpful when you go to dispose of those hard drives or if they're lost. So there's two scenarios, right? Where you get rid of the technology at some point and it's encrypted, so you don't have to worry so much about wiping it, or if it gets stolen in some fashion, then oh boy, it's encrypted, so we don't have to worry so much about it, right? But there are a whole lot of ways, there are a lot of scenarios in which that data can be compromised, where encryption buys you zip. And in fact, there are scenarios where encryption actually increases risk, right? So what if you lose the keys or those sorts of things? So essentially, define the set of scenarios where that data is at risk. Within that set of scenarios, which subset is encryption relevant and helpful, and maybe in which ones does it make things worse, right? And then once you've defined those, just that process in itself, I found on some occasions, without even qualitatively, assessing things, there have been instances where, just laying out the scenarios is enough information for people to go, oh, well, okay, yeah, I see more what we're dealing with here, and maybe encryption isn't the right answer, or maybe these other things would be better, these other options. But at any rate, so you've laid out these scenarios, you've identified which ones encryption is relevant to. And having those scenarios, you can also say, well, here are other control opportunities for these scenarios that affect the same scenarios where encryption provides value, and maybe some other scenarios where encryption doesn't provide value, right? So you begin to lay out the control opportunities besides encryption and see just side by side, maybe you've got some that apply to more scenarios. And then once you've done that, then you can begin evaluating their effect on probability and impact of these loss events, these scenarios. And once you have that, then you have the means for actually comparing solutions and such. So just to kind of wrap that up too, I mean, I was a CISO for one company that was subject to PCI, and encryption of data at rest was a requirement. And I was faced with this situation of having to encrypt ungodly amounts of sensitive information on databases with huge throughput requirements. And at that point, the encryption industry, when I talked to the vendors, they said, well, we've never had to encrypt that much data with that significant throughput requirement, but we'd be happy to try, and it will cost you this many millions of dollars and take 18 months, and you're going to have to rewrite your applications and so on, right? And that's what drove me to do this, breakdown and comparison of other control opportunities. And at the end of the day, I came up with a set of control opportunities that cost a small fraction of as much money, required no application rewrites, and I could show through analysis reduced risk more than encryption. And when I put that in front of the PCI auditor, they said, well, I can't argue with that. And they, checked off, and we were on our way, and management was thrilled.
Gosh, I think that's one of the biggest pieces is that but I think you also, I don't know why this is different in different companies. Maybe you'll have some insight there, but I find some IT and IT security professionals feel like they don't feel like they can go not toe to toe with the auditor. It implies combat, but in many respects we are protecting an organization. So there has to be some in auditors asking someone, or not necessarily an auditor, but a government entity or an internal audit is asking someone to spend money. There has to be somebody there that says, I know you want me to spend money, $100,000 in encrypting the data at the core, but what about if we have 400 employees? What about if we educated them about not clicking on stuff on the internet? So maybe we wouldn't get the infection to begin with. And I'm being radically simple, but that would be an example of one scenario. But you might list 10 scenarios that eliminate human error within the organization that would have prevented that problem to begin with. That auditor was thinking that they should encrypt a hard drive. Yeah. And so is that the scenario piece that you're looking at building out?
Yeah. And the reason I think a lot of people are hesitant to go toe-to-toe with an authoritative figure like an auditor or a regulator is because they're operating from intuition, right? Their gut is saying, no, this is not the solution. This is not a good choice, right? But they haven't applied a rigorous approach to developing their argument, which, by the way, sometimes your intuition's wrong, and you go through the process of preparing for battle and going, well, you know what, they're right. That's okay too. But very often your intuition is right if you've been in the industry long enough and had the battle scars and such. What you need is a framework, again, which is what FAIR is first and foremost, is this framework for critical thinking through these complex problems and developing your arguments and rationale, surfacing assumptions and making your estimates and these sorts of things that you put in front of the auditors. And I guarantee you that if you go through that process, if some authoritative figure, an auditor or whoever, has put forth an argument, thou shalt do whatever, right? I can guarantee you they have not applied any rigor to it. I've never seen it.
No, I agree with you 100%. I just feel, and I think that's really important, that point you just made, to going toe-to-toe. Obviously, they're very uncomfortable. I find most of the professionals, the IT professionals, their intuition is completely flaring up. I mean, there's red warning signs, but they don't have the ability to take it to a non-emotional level using a tool kit or using a method like FAIR. And I think it's funny, these words, even your co-author in your book use words like critical thinking, Socratic method. There's been a boost in, it was funny, ironically, a boost in philosophy majors in college because they're really trying to get people to think in a very logical way now. And I find that really interesting to be able to back up one's intuition with a more rigorous approach in learning some of these methods so that they can have a defensible arguments.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually have gotten to the point where I look forward to when someone comes to me and says, thou shalt, I get a big grin on my face. I said, really? Let's talk about this, because, and I don't know, maybe I have a mean streak in me or what, but I enjoy deconstructing someone's position. And I don't do it in a mean way, but I view it as an educational opportunity, right? And maybe they're right and it's an educational opportunity for me. But regardless, the process of really looking at the problem and the potential solutions in this more rigorous critical thinking like fashion is hugely valuable. And long before I started actually applying numbers to FAIR, just having the framework for thinking through and debating and discussing things was hugely valuable to me. The numbers came later.
I think that's an important point, though. That's a huge one, because I find that the numbers could scare people away because they're trying to get even a pace and a hold of all the pressures around them. But that was a really important point I think you just said, was that you felt like that you gained a lot of mileage just even from the structured thinking process.
Yeah, absolutely. And another related component to that is normalizing terminology. And I don't recall if in our previous interview I used this point of
I don't think
approach
you did.
I'm about to make. So one of the things I like to do when I'm in front of an audience, and I do it almost every chance I get now, is I'll ask how many people in the audience would write a space shuttle mission if they were given the opportunity. And you typically see about half the hands in the room go up. And I'll follow that by saying, all right, now how many of you with your hands in the air would ride that mission if you knew that the scientists and engineers who designed the spacecraft and planned the mission couldn't agree on the definition of mass, weight, and velocity? Nobody's hand remains in the air. Nobody's going to ride that mission. But that is exactly the state of our profession, information security and risk management profession. It's not just information security, it's audit, it's operational risk. It's crazy how badly used.
This is so good, though. This is why this FAIR model is such an important approach, because when's the last time, if the CEO went to the CFO and said, show me the income statement for this past year, the CFO does not look at him with a blank stare. But what does the CEO go to the CISO or the CIO and say, show me your summary statement of information risk for the year? And they wouldn't, where do you go?
And you know what you'll get. And we regularly, every organization I've been to, I can say that with complete 100% certainty. Every organization I've stepped into in the last 2 years, when I look at kind of the quote unquote summary of their information security risk position, it includes a quote unquote list of top 10 risks. And invariably, that list includes things like cyber criminals and social engineering and change management and mobile media and cloud computing. And if you look at what I just laid out to you there, well, cyber criminals are a threat community. Cloud computing is a technology. Change management is a control element. Those are not loss scenarios. That's like comparing apples and oranges. And is, again, this blog series, and it's on we can talk about this more in a minute, but the fairinstitute.org has blogs, and I'm in the midst of doing this series that talks about this and how screwed up organizations are in identifying and trying to manage quote unquote top risks. And it is a huge problem. We cannot rationally, reasonably expect as an industry, as a profession, to mature if we can't get fundamental nomenclature straight. I mean, everything else has very little hope if we don't get that straight.
Well, how could someone improve? So everybody probably listening has seen their top 10 list and had the opportunity to present their top 10 list in some way, shape, or form. What's an easy step that someone could fundamentally transform what that top 10 looks like related to, I use the word loss scenarios. Could you calculate the likelihood of these happening and projected revenue impact? What would be a good way to change that top 10 list around a little bit?
So if their top 10 list is like all the others I've seen, which is just a hodgepodge of stuff within the risk landscape, they cannot prioritize that. Sorry, it can't be done. They have to, in my view, create two lists. One is a list of the top loss scenarios. And I alluded to that earlier when I said, create this taxonomy of loss event scenarios, analyze those to determine which ones represent the most loss exposure to you.
And the word taxonomy, just so people don't think it's dead animals. A taxonomy is just a list of outcomes.
It's a categorization. It's a way to break down. So if you take, mammals and amphibians and such, that whole categorizing creatures into a taxonomy that distinguishes them from one another, right? So you're categorizing loss events.
Okay, makes sense.
To a level of abstraction that is not way down in the weeds, but not too high. There's a balance to be struck there, and it's pretty easy to recognize where that balance is as you go through the process. But you identify these scenarios, then you either qualitatively, if you want to, if that's where your starting point is, or quantitatively, then do a likelihood or probability and impact around each of those, and that'll give you a sense for, right, out of all these, which ones really are our top 5 or 10, right? Now the other list, right? So that's one top 10 or 5 or how many lists you want. The other list is, all right, what are control deficiencies, right? And that's where your common quote unquote risk assessment is really a controls assessment. There's very little to do with risk measurement. You look at those and you say, all right, now how do we prioritize those? Well, having done your top loss event scenario list, you can say, look through those control conditions, say, which of these is contributing most to all that risk we've got over here, right? And that allows you to identify your top X number of control conditions. And again, there's a relationship between those two lists, but you certainly can't munge them together, right? But they have that important relationship, and that's a very simple way to begin to get a handle on your risk landscape and identify where do we need to be focusing. Because you look at the top list of control deficiencies, kind of map them to which loss event scenarios they're relevant to and whether they're highly relevant or less relevant or whatever the case might be. It's not rocket science then to say, all right, well, these 3 or these 4, we need to be hitting these hard. And oh, by the way, by hitting those hard over here on the control deficiency list, we can say over time it's going to reduce, or change this list of top loss event scenarios, right? So, just first and foremost, recognizing that you have to have these two lists.
Yeah.
The typical top 10 risk is worse than useless because you can't compare those things. It's misinformation in the worst way. So that's kind of
that's huge. That's really big, and I think their listeners are going to really appreciate that. Believe it or not, we're at the end of our time together. We could go on and on. I think I've got through a small percentage of my questions, but maybe we can do a round 2 this year.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, let's. How can people learn more information? I highly recommend the book "Measuring and Managing Information Risk." That's the book you co-authored with Jack Froun. How do you pronounce his name? Froun. That's really excellent. But how else can people learn? You mentioned a couple organizations, blogs, and such. But I'll let you, and I'll link this in the show notes afterwards.
Yeah, we're just now firing up a nonprofit called the FAIR Institute, and it's intended to be a community of people who want to learn more about FAIR and people who are using FAIR and have challenges that they're encountering and how they've ways in which they've succeeded and solutions they've applied using it and that sort of thing. So it's just a way to get education out there and build this ecosystem of people and organizations to leverage this framework, understand and leverage this framework. And it includes, we have members like the Open Group that has made FAIR an international standard. There are universities that are taking part. In fact, there's a special sub-community, if you will, being developed in the FAIR Institute for universities who are including FAIR in their curricula for master's programs in information security. In fact, one university includes FAIR in its economics degree.
Oh, interesting.
For risk analysis. So at any rate, the FAIR Institute, there will be blogs, there will be other resources there. There are people, it's free to join, and there are different levels of membership. So if a senior executive in an organization joins, then there are some perks that come along with that, like a free copy of the book and a free high-level risk maturity assessment and these sort of things. So at any rate, it's something that we're launching formally. It's sort of informally launched, soft launch in December, formal launch, I think, here in February.
Well, that's good because right about the time this airs, it'll be about the time it's launching.
Oh, okay. And it has memberships from the smallest, some very small organizations to some of the largest in the world are taking part already. So there's that. There's the Open Group, which is opengroup.org, has resources related to FAIR, and they have a certification for practitioners. And then, of course, the Risk Lens website, we have our blog, and we have resources, case studies, and such that we publish. So those are, and as you said, the book. So there's getting to be some good information out there on this.
Oh, good. So the last part you mentioned was Risk Lens, which is your company that does FAIR consulting and has an application. Opengroup.org, which you co-founded, right?
No, the Open Group it's been around for years. They're the organization that owns the intellectual property to Unix, right?
Oh, right. Okay, I'm with you now.
And TOGAF, if you're familiar with that. So they adopted FAIR. And have their own resources around that sort of thing. And then the FAIR Institute is something sure. I'm co-founding.
Well, this is great, Jack. I love these resources for the community and listeners. This will be a nice way to help launch the FAIR Institute. And there's definitely ways here people can reach out and reach you. And I appreciate you for your time. This has been a real privilege.
Oh, thank you. I always enjoy it and happy to do it anytime you're interested.
So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.